I am Peter's mother-in-law, and my daughter should never have married him in the first place. I told her that she would never be home. He was impulsive, he had a temper, he was always spouting off about something or the other. And besides, I didn't know much about his family, not as much as I wanted to. We had met his father, Jonah, and he was a likable guy, but his son, Peter, well, that was a different story. I don't know how much you know about marriages in our day. I mean, usually it was the parents who arranged the wedding, and more often than not, the parents knew each other better than the kids who were getting married. But it was different for our kids. It was the other way around, because she fell for him the first time she laid her eyes on him. And don't ask me what she saw, but she wouldn't be talked out of it. Well, as I said, they were a nice enough family, but it could have been worse. But he was a fisherman. He always hung out with the sons of Zebedee, and boy, those two were hotheads, if you can say so. And don't get me wrong. Fishing is a noble or an honorable profession. It's just that they were always gone. I mean, more often than not, they'd be fishing all night. By the time they came in after a whole night's fishing, they'd got the fish cleaned and to the market, and then the nets were cleaned up. They'd usually sleep all the way till the next night because they were so tired. They were really a rough bunch. Big talkers and big ideas about what they were going to do, about how they were going to revolutionize the fishing industry, how they were going to have the biggest fishing enterprise on the Sea of Galilee. Oh, that kind of thing. It's not that I minded male bravado. I guess I remember my husband, when he was younger, had a bunch of male bravado too. But unfortunately, my husband wasn't around to talk much these days about things. He died a few years ago during the plague. We didn't have the medical knowledge that you do now, and we didn't have medicines either. So whenever an illness ravished a community, we would do little about it. But maybe that's why things bothered me so much. I just didn't have anybody to talk to about them. I don't know. Maybe it was my own loneliness that made me feel for my daughter. I just wanted Peter to spend a little more time with her. But then I guess, as a mother, I should have just kept out of it. I mean, every time I would try to bring the subject up, my daughter would say, oh, Mom, that's just Peter. I know he loves me. Well, it was obvious how she felt about him, and I have to admit that even if things weren't perfect the way that I thought they should have been, he was always kind to her, and he treated her in a special way, at least when I was around. Remember how I told you how impulsive that Peter was? Well, something happened that not only confirmed it, but just about sent me over the brink. Now, I told you I wasn't very crazy about his occupation, fishing, but at least it was an occupation, and at least he had a fairly regular income. I knew my daughter wasn't going to starve. But can you imagine how I felt when my daughter told me that her husband wasn't going to fish anymore? He was going to be a disciple of some traveling preacher by the name of Jesus. Where did this notion come from? Who is this Jesus? And why in the world is Peter going to follow him? And follow him where? How is he going to put bread on the table for my daughter? And what about children? Haven't they thought about having a family? How's he going to raise a family if he doesn't even have a job? And how's he ever going to start a family if he's never even home doing who knows what somewhere with who knows who? For some reason, my daughter didn't seem to have any concerns at all. She said she'd met this Jesus. And although she couldn't exactly describe why, she said she knew that things would turn out okay. She turned to me one time and she said, "Mom, you should meet him. Save your judgment until you at least meet him." Well, what am I going to say to that? I mean, what do you say when your child throws back at you the same words that you use to teach her about right and wrong and judging others? What do you say except, yes, dear, I guess you're right. I will try not to judge him until I've at least met him. Well, it would have been several months before I had the chance to actually meet him, but during those months, I began hearing all kinds of reports about Peter and this Jesus and what they were doing in the area. Some of my neighbors had even told me that they'd gone to hear Jesus. And they remarked that he had a way with people. That's what they said. And that people were drawn to him. Still, I had my doubts. You know, those traveling preachers, they're always going here and there. Some of them were even going to overthrow the Roman government, or at least they thought so. Others just fancied themselves great speakers. Most of them never amounted to anything. Many of them were popular for a while, and then a year later, nobody even remembered who they were or what they said. What was Peter getting himself into? Well, as the days went on, I heard more and more reports of how this Jesus actually healed people. Not just the kind of illnesses that people can fake, but actual people who had been known to be crippled or blind since birth. I mean, you can't fake that. And I began to think that maybe my daughter was right about this Jesus. And then the day came when I first met Jesus. Now, by that time, I had moved in with my daughter. It was a mutual decision, partially because of my health and partly because I had been right about Peter not coming home very much. It was a chance for us to keep ourselves company. So not long after I settled in my home, Peter and some of his friends, along with Jesus, came to the house, and they wanted to get away for a couple of days. They talked about the crowds and how they were constantly pressing in on him and how everybody wanted to get close to Jesus, both to hear him and also to receive healing from some diseases that they had. Well, you could see those people were exhausted, and so my daughter suggested that we fix a meal for them. Well, you know me. I want answers to questions. And I wanted to ask questions, but I didn't know whether it was proper for me to do so. And as it turned out, I can't believe it, but I didn't have to. Because while I was busy cooking, it was Jesus who took the initiative to talk to me. It was strange. It was as though he knew all of my questions, my concerns, my fears for my daughter. He talked about Peter, about his impulsiveness and bravado, and we both laughed about it. But then he told me of how he saw tremendous potential in his leadership underneath that rough exterior. And for a moment, as a mom, I was feeling a lot better, that maybe my daughter knew more about Peter than I realized. Well, that night after supper, he taught us all about scriptures in a way that I had never heard before. He was able to explain things in a way that I could actually understand. So the next morning I got up and early, I was going to fix breakfast as I usually do, but Jesus came in while I was cooking. It seems he had gone out before dawn to spend some time in prayer, and he looked refreshed and full of energy, and he asked about my husband. And he even offered a prayer for peace and strength for me. And that really touched me because he seemed to know that the pain of my loss was far from disappeared. But after those days, I spent time following Jesus. I watched him from a distance, and I began to see what Peter and all the others saw. I came to believe that Jesus was a teacher that was sent from God, because nobody could say or do the things he said unless it was from God. And then came the day that I would experience the divine power myself. You see, I'd come down with a fever, and I was burning up, and I was in bed at my daughter's. Remember, I told you I was living there. She would alternate covering me up with blankets when I was chilled and giving me water when I was hot. And at the moments when I was lucid, which didn't seem like very many, all I could think of was that's the way my husband was before he died. I kept falling into a deep sleep, and every time I woke up, I could see the worry on my daughter's face. And I didn't know it at the time, but she had sent for Peter to come home, because I'm sure she wondered, like me, what was really going to happen next. Well, I found out later that Peter did come home, but he didn't come alone. He brought Jesus with him. All I remember is this. I lay down in the bed. It's all I could do. I opened my eyes, and there was Jesus smiling at me. He reached down, and he took my hand. And as soon as he took my hand, something happened that I cannot explain. A kind of tingling, literally surged through my body, and I realized that my fever was gone. I sat up, I kind of shook my head in disbelief, and felt like I was completely well and full of strength. And I stood up, and not knowing what to do, I reached out, I put my arms around Jesus, and I kissed him. Well, I think I kind of took him by surprise, because he got this stunned look on his face, and then we both laughed. I didn't know how to thank him, so I did what I do best. I went into the kitchen and I started cooking. I don't know how Jesus and the others felt about that meal, but for me, it was the best meal I had ever tasted. Well, after that night, nobody knew better than me that my son-in-law, Peter, had made the right decision to follow Jesus. Of course, at the time, no one knew what was coming. And I think it's a good thing that we didn't know what was coming, because nobody could have guessed that Jesus would one day be arrested and killed. When it happened, we were all devastated. People barely talked to each other. We didn't know what to say, because how could such a thing happen? Not only that, but Peter, John, and some of the women had gone to the tomb on Sunday, and Jesus' body was gone. Nobody knew what to think. Peter was beside himself. For such a strong man, full of that male bravado that I told you about, he was weeping uncontrollably. He kept talking about how he, more than anybody else, had let Jesus down, about how he had denied him and denied even knowing him. Well, we didn't have a clue what he was talking about, only that he just kept crying and mumbling. And then everything changed. Peter later came running through the door. We've seen him, he's alive. And several days later, we would see Jesus too. It was true. It was true. Jesus was alive. And suddenly in our lives, hope was alive again. And our lives would never be the same. You know, yours too need never be the same again either. Because Jesus is alive. He's here tonight. Trust him. Follow him. Peter was right. Jesus is the one we've all been waiting for.